She said, "Trust me." And that's when everything changed. It all started on a quiet evening that seemed just like any other. The house was calm, the kind of silence that makes you notice every small sound, every little detail. And then came those words that would change everything. Trust me. At first, they sounded simple, almost ordinary. But as the night unfolded, they became the key to a story no one expected. A story of choices, of fear, of trust, and of how one moment can set a chain of events in motion that alters lives forever. She stood there, her eyes filled with something hard to explain, part determination, part desperation. Her stepfather, unsure and hesitant, looked back at her. He didn't know whether to believe the words or question them. But sometimes, in life, we don't get the luxury of certainty. Sometimes, we're forced to decide in a split second, not realizing how deep the consequences might run. This is not just another story, it's a true story. It's about family, about secrets that slowly rise to the surface, and about the fragile bond of trust that can either hold people together or push them apart. What makes this story unforgettable is not just what happened, but how it all began with those two words. Trust me. As the night grew darker, the atmosphere inside the house began to change. Every glance, every step, every word seemed heavier than before. He didn't realize that by listening to her, he was walking straight into a turning point that no one could undo. And from that moment on, nothing was ever the same again. What really happened after those words were spoken? And why did everything change so suddenly? That's where this story begins and where the mystery truly unfolds. The story didn't begin in that single moment, though it might have seemed that way. To understand why those two words mattered so much, we need to step back. Life in their home was never truly quiet. On the outside, it looked like an ordinary family, but beneath the surface, things were far from simple. She had always been different, observant, thoughtful, carrying more on her shoulders than most people her age. Her stepfather, on the other hand, was a man who liked routines, someone who preferred to keep life steady and predictable. Their worlds often clashed, but there was also a fragile bond that sometimes showed itself in the smallest gestures. Still, trust was something that didn't come easily in that house. There were unspoken questions lingering in the air, things no one wanted to confront directly. The past carried its own shadows, and those shadows never fully disappeared. Some nights were filled with laughter, but other nights were weighed down by silence, and in that silence lived the unasked questions, the kind that made you wonder what was really going on when no one was watching. So when she looked at him that evening and said, "Trust me," it wasn't just a request. It was loaded with everything they had gone through before. It was about choices that had been avoided for too long. He couldn't help but notice the intensity in her voice, the urgency that told him something was different this time. But different how? Was she protecting him from something? Or was she leading him into something he couldn't yet see? He thought about the past moments when she had spoken with that same conviction. Sometimes she was right and listening to her saved them from bigger problems. Other times, following her words only led to confusion. That unpredictability made the air even heavier. The clock ticked louder than usual, each second stretching longer, as if time itself knew something was about to happen. The house felt colder, the shadows seemed darker, and the silence carried a weight that pressed down on him. He wanted to ask questions, but something inside held him back. Maybe it was fear of the answer. Maybe it was the feeling that once he knew, there would be no going back. She repeated the words once more, softer this time, but filled with the same urgency. "Trust me." And that's when he realized whatever was about to unfold was already set in motion. He just didn't know whether it would bring them closer or tear everything apart. The night grew heavier, and the silence between them seemed almost unbearable. He searched her face for answers, but all he found was a mix of fear and determination. It wasn't the kind of fear that made someone freeze. It was the kind that pushed a person to act quickly, as if time was running out. That look unsettled him. Whatever she wanted him to trust her with, it wasn't small. It wasn't something that could be brushed aside. The conflict ran deeper than that moment. For months, there had been whispers in the background, unfinished conversations, strange phone calls late at night, and unexplained absences that no one cared to fully address. She had noticed them first, always more alert than anyone else in the house. At times, she tried to bring it up, but her stepfather never wanted to hear it. He believed in holding the family together by not asking too many questions. She, on the other hand, believed that ignoring the truth only made things worse. That difference between them had become a quiet war of its own. Now, those differences seemed to collide in one chilling moment. He couldn't shake the thought. Was she finally revealing something she had been holding back? Or was she asking him to walk blindly into her version of the truth? Trust had always been a fragile thread between them, and that night, it was being tested more than ever. Other parts of their world only added to the weight. Neighbors had begun to notice the odd tension in the household. Friends whispered about how distant she had become, how her once bright smile now carried a shadow. Even family gatherings weren't the same. There were always side glances, uneasy silences, moments when something almost slipped out but never did. These small pieces, when put together, painted a picture he didn't want to admit was real. Inside the house, the air felt charged, as though the walls themselves were listening. Every corner seemed to hold secrets, and every sound carried more meaning than it should have. He wondered if trusting her would unravel everything he had tried so hard to keep in place. She wondered if he would finally believe her before it was too late. And in that fragile space between silence and confession, the real conflict began to take shape, not just about what was happening, but about how far each of them was willing to go for the truth. The air inside the house felt thick, almost unbreathable, as though the walls themselves were closing in. He tried to steady his breathing, but his chest rose and fell faster with each passing second. Her words echoed in his mind. Trust me, and though he had heard them before, they carried a weight this time that made his heart pound. He knew that something hidden was about to surface, something that had been kept in the dark for far too long. She paced the room, restless, her eyes darting toward the window as if she expected someone, or something, to appear at any moment. The tension between them grew sharper with every step she took. He wanted to ask again what this was all about, but her expression stopped him. She wasn't ready to explain, not fully, and he wasn't ready to hear it. Yet the silence stretched so far that it felt louder than any scream. It wasn't just about them anymore. It felt bigger, as if invisible strings were pulling at every part of their lives. He thought about the strange letters that had arrived weeks ago, letters he had dismissed as mistakes, addressed to no one in particular. She hadn't dismissed them. She had kept them, read them, studied them in secret. Now, standing in front of him, her eyes told him those letters weren't mistakes. They were warnings. He remembered the uneasy glances from neighbors, the way conversations always seemed to fall quiet when he walked into the room. At the time, he brushed it off as coincidence, but the memories came rushing back with a new edge. People had known something. They had seen something. And somehow, she had picked up on it before anyone else. The clock on the wall ticked louder and louder, every second stretching into eternity. She finally stopped pacing and looked straight at him. Her voice was firm but trembling at the edges, the way a person speaks when they're forcing themselves to stay strong. If you don't trust me now, you'll regret it, she said softly. But once you decide, there's no turning back. His hands tightened around the chair in front of him. He didn't want to believe her, because believing her meant accepting that everything he thought was safe might not be. But he also couldn't ignore the way her voice cracked just slightly at the end. She wasn't only warning him, she was pleading with him. A sudden noise from outside shattered the silence. Both of them froze. It wasn't loud, but in the quiet of the night, it sounded like a signal. She rushed to the window, pulled back the curtain just enough to peek through. Her face went pale, and she turned back quickly. "It's happening," she whispered. His heart raced. He didn't even know what it was, but the way she said it made his stomach twist. The room felt smaller, the night darker, the unknown closer. He stood still, caught between disbelief and fear, while she stood ready, as if she had been preparing for this moment all along. Everything was building towards something inevitable, and he knew whatever choice he made next would decide not just the night, but everything that followed. The sound outside lingered in his ears, faint but unsettling, like the quiet tap of something against the world he thought was solid. She stood rigid by the window, her hand trembling slightly as she let the curtain fall back into place. Her pale face told him enough. Whatever she saw, it wasn't ordinary. For a moment, he wondered if it was just her nerves, her imagination stretching shadows into monsters. But then another sound echoed through the silence, closer this time. It was real. He felt the floor shift beneath him, not physically, but in the way that certainty collapses. His first instinct was to rush to the door, but she stepped in front of him, blocking the way. "Don't," she said firmly. Her eyes were sharper now, no longer pleading but commanding. It was as if she had crossed some invisible line and taken control. That shift alone rattled him. And then came the twist he never expected. She pulled something from her pocket, a small folded note, crumpled at the edges, as though it had been handled many times. "They left this for you," she whispered, pressing it into his hand. His chest tightened as he unfolded the paper. The handwriting was jagged, almost rushed, but the message was clear. "We know what you've hidden. Tonight is the end of it." His blood ran cold. He didn't know who they were, and worse, he didn't know what they thought he was hiding. But the fear in her eyes told him that she did. She had been keeping something from him all along. She wasn't just warning him, she was tied to whatever was happening. The second twist landed heavier than the first realization. She hadn't just asked for his trust out of desperation. She had been preparing for this night, maybe longer than he could imagine. All those moments she disappeared without explanation. All the late nights she stayed awake when the rest of the house slept. It was all connected. He wanted to confront her, to demand the truth, but before he could speak, another noise cracked the night. This time, it wasn't faint. It was sharp, deliberate, like footsteps on the gravel outside. She grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the door. "You have to believe me," she whispered urgently. "They're not coming for me. They're coming for you." The words cut deeper than the note. His mind spun. Why him? What could he have possibly done to draw this shadow into their lives? Yet the terror in her voice wasn't the kind you could fake. She wasn't trying to scare him, she was trying to save him. The stakes had shifted in an instant. What began as her secret plea for trust was now tangled with something much larger, something dangerous and closing in on them. He realized with a sickening feeling that she had been protecting him all along, not the other way around. And still, the question loomed, heavier than ever. Trust her or run from her. Because whichever choice he made, the sound of those footsteps outside made one thing certain. Time was running out. The footsteps outside grew louder, steady and deliberate, until they stopped just beyond the front door. Every muscle in his body tensed. He looked at her, searching for an answer, but she only tightened her grip on his arm and shook her head, urging him to stay quiet. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the creak of the porch under someone's weight. Whoever was out there wasn't hiding. They wanted to be heard. Then, without warning, there was a knock, slow, heavy, and deliberate. He felt his heart slam in his chest. The note still trembled in his hand, its words burning in his mind. "We know what you've hidden." He had spent years convincing himself that the past was behind him, that no one would ever uncover it. But now it had followed him to his doorstep. She moved first. With surprising calm, she opened the door just a fraction. He braced himself, but instead of a stranger, there stood a familiar face, one he hadn't seen in years. It was his old friend, someone he once trusted more than anyone, someone who knew parts of his past he thought were buried forever. But his friend's expression wasn't friendly anymore. It was cold, determined, and he held another letter in his hand. "You can't hide this any longer," the man said quietly. "It ends tonight." The truth hit him all at once. The letters, the tension, her desperate plea, it was all connected. His stepdaughter had discovered pieces of his past long before tonight. She hadn't been hiding something dangerous for herself. She had been carrying the weight of his secrets, trying to shield him from the storm she knew was coming. Her words, "Trust me," were not just about survival. They were about facing the truth together. He finally understood. The real conflict wasn't between them, but within himself. The fear of being exposed, the fear of losing the fragile family he had built. With a heavy breath, he stepped forward, ready to face what he had spent so long running from. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, she stepped between them, holding up her hand. "No," she said firmly. "If this ends tonight, it ends on my terms." Both men froze, stunned. And in that moment, the final twist unfolded. She wasn't just a bystander caught in his past. She had her own secret connection to the man at the door, one that neither of them had seen coming. The night had begun with his hidden truth, but it was about to end with hers. The silence that followed her words was heavier than anything that had come before. He looked at her, then at the man at the door, and suddenly the pieces began to fall into place. The connection wasn't just about his past, it was about hers too. She had known this man long before he reappeared tonight, though she had kept that truth hidden. All the late nights, all the whispers, all the times she avoided his questions. It wasn't betrayal. It was preparation. Her voice was steady now, no longer trembling. "I've been protecting him," she said, pointing to her stepfather, "because I knew this night would come. But I've also been protecting myself. You're not here just for him. You're here because of me." The man at the door lowered his gaze, as if her words carried a truth he didn't want to admit. For the first time, he saw her not as the child he had raised, but as someone far stronger, someone who had carried the weight of 2 lives on her shoulders. She had pieced together the secrets, navigated the dangers, and waited until the very last moment to reveal the full picture. Trust, it turned out, had been the thread holding everything together all along. The tension eased slowly, like a storm finally breaking. The man at the door said nothing more, only nodded once before stepping back into the night, leaving the house in silence again. There were no shouts, no final confrontation, just the quiet acceptance that the truth had been spoken and there was nothing left to chase. Inside, he finally felt the heaviness in his chest lift. For years he had lived with the fear of being found out, of losing everything if his past resurfaced. Yet tonight proved something different. Facing the truth didn't break them. It bound them closer. She had chosen to stand by him when it mattered most, and in return, he finally understood the weight of her words. "Trust me," she had said. And though it took a night filled with fear, secrets, and shadows, he realized that trust had been the only answer all along. As the house settled into quiet once more, a strange peace filled the air. Their lives would not be simple, and the past would never fully vanish, but they had faced it together. And in that choice, they discovered something stronger than fear: family, loyalty, and the unshakable bond of truth. The story ended not with what they had lost, but with what they had gained. A reminder that trust, once given, can change everything.